Sometimes the brightest runway is the one no one believes still exists. The voice crackled through the headset just after midnight, thin with static and heavy with fear. Somewhere above the endless mountains of western Montana, a sleek private jet circled through thick storm clouds with fuel running lower by the minute. Every modern airport within reach had closed because of the violent crosswinds, and every official chart insisted there was nowhere left to land. Yet one aging pilot stared at a faded mark blinking on an outdated navigation display. It was a forgotten airstrip, abandoned years ago and erased from nearly every database. "That place cannot still be operational," his co-pilot whispered. Silence filled the cockpit except for the steady hum of the engines and the soft warning tones reminding everyone that time was running out. Far below, surrounded by miles of open prairie and towering pines, a lone man looked up from an old generator as the distant sound of jet engines drifted across the cold night air. Caleb Hayes tightened his weathered work gloves and listened carefully. He knew that sound. He had spent years around aircraft before life had carried him somewhere quieter. These days, the only engines he usually heard belonged to pickup trucks passing the old property everyone else had forgotten. The abandoned airstrip sat outside the tiny community of Silver Creek, Montana, where faded hangars leaned against the wind like tired old soldiers and cracked pavement disappeared beneath stubborn weeds. The locals called it a ghost runway. Teenagers dared each other to drive across it after sunset, and travelers barely noticed the rusted sign leaning beside the empty entrance road. But every morning before sunrise, while the rest of the town slept, Caleb arrived with a toolbox, a shovel, and more determination than money. He patched broken concrete one section at a time. He replaced damaged wiring salvage from auctions. He cleaned old runway lights until they shined again, even though no airplane had landed there in years. Most people laughed. Some called him foolish. Others asked why a struggling single father would waste precious time fixing a place. Nobody wanted. Caleb never argued. He simply smiled, climbed back onto his old utility vehicle, and kept working. His 8-year-old daughter, Lucy, believed the runway had a heartbeat. She often sat on the tailgate after school swinging her legs while sketching airplanes in a notebook covered with colorful stickers. "One day somebody will need this place," she always said with complete confidence. Caleb would smile at her optimism without promising anything. Hope was easier to protect when it stayed quiet. Earlier that same evening, Lucy had handed him a flashlight before bedtime. "Don't forget to check the lights tonight, Daddy," she had whispered. "Just in case." He kissed her forehead, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, and promised he would. Now, standing alone beneath a sky hidden by thick clouds, Caleb looked toward the control shed where dusty switches waited patiently in the darkness. Then the old emergency radio resting on a shelf suddenly hissed to life after years of silence. A strained voice fought through the static. "Is anyone on the ground? This is Executive Flight 714 requesting any available runway. Please respond." Caleb closed his eyes for one brief moment. The runway everyone had forgotten was about to face the reason it had been waiting all these years. Caleb reached for the weathered microphone, brushed a thin layer of dust from the switch, and answered with the calm voice of a man who had learned long ago that panic never solved a problem. "Executive Flight 714, this is Silver Creek Airstrip. I read you." For nearly 3 seconds, there was nothing except static. Then the pilot replied with unmistakable relief. "Ground station, please confirm. Is the runway operational?" Caleb looked through the window toward the dark pavement stretching across the prairie. The runway was not officially open. It had never passed another inspection. No government records listed it as active. But every cracked light fixture had been rebuilt by his own hands. Every drainage ditch cleared before spring rains. Every reflector polished one quiet afternoon at a time. "The runway is usable," he answered honestly. "Give me a few minutes to bring the lights online." Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Mercer glanced toward his co-pilot before speaking again. "We appreciate any help you can provide." Caleb placed the microphone down gently and hurried outside. The cold Montana wind pushed against his jacket as clouds rolled across the moon, leaving the entire valley wrapped in darkness. He climbed into his aging utility truck, turned the key twice before the engine finally came alive, and drove toward the first electrical junction box nearly half a mile away. The old generator had enough fuel because he had filled it earlier that afternoon, just like every Friday, despite never expecting anyone to need it. Some people called routines pointless. Caleb called them preparation. As the diesel engine rumbled to life, one row of runway lights flickered weakly before glowing brighter against the night. Still, only half the runway could be seen. He drove farther, stopping every few hundred feet to throw another switch by hand. One light after another awakened from years of silence until a ribbon of warm amber stretched across the forgotten pavement. Meanwhile, back inside the modest farmhouse, Lucy stirred beneath her blanket. She blinked toward her bedroom window after noticing an unfamiliar glow dancing across the curtains. Rubbing her sleepy eyes, she quietly climbed onto a chair and peeked outside. The distant runway shimmered like a necklace of tiny stars across the valley floor. She smiled to herself without waking anyone else. "I knew somebody would need it," she whispered into the quiet room. High above the mountains, Captain Mercer finally spotted the lights through a narrow break in the clouds. "Runway in sight," he announced, and every person aboard released a breath they had been holding. Sitting quietly in the private cabin was a young blonde woman named Olivia Reynolds. She wore a simple navy sweater instead of the designer suits that usually surrounded her public appearances. No reporters knew she was traveling tonight. No assistants occupied the seats beside her. To the passengers, she appeared to be another business traveler trying to reach a meeting before sunrise. Only her chief legal advisor knew she was actually returning from a confidential visit involving the future of her aviation technology company. Olivia looked through the oval window as the lonely strip of lights appeared beneath the aircraft. There was no towering terminal, no bright control tower, no busy airport traffic. Only one narrow runway glowing against endless darkness. Something about that quiet scene touched her in a way that billion-dollar headquarters and luxury airports never had. She had no idea that one humble father standing alone beneath those lights was about to change the direction of far more than a single flight. The jet descended slowly through the thinning clouds, its landing lights cutting long white paths across the prairie as Caleb stood beside the final switch box with one hand resting on the weathered control panel. Every instinct he had developed during his years around military aircraft returned without effort. He watched the windsock sway against the darkness, estimated the crosswind, checked the brightness of every lamp one last time, and spoke into the radio with the same steady confidence that had once reassured nervous young pilots. "Wind is holding from the northwest at 12 miles per hour. The center section is clear. Stay slightly left until the final 100 yards. You have plenty of room." Captain Daniel Mercer exchanged another surprised glance with his co-pilot. Whoever this man was, he did not sound like someone guessing. He sounded like someone who understood airplanes as if they were old friends. "Understood," the captain replied. "Beginning final approach." Olivia rested her hand lightly against the window as the lonely runway grew larger beneath the aircraft. The lights were not perfectly even. A few glowed brighter than others, and one near the southern edge flickered gently before shining steadily again. Yet those small imperfections made the place feel strangely alive. Someone had cared enough to keep every light burning even after the rest of the world had forgotten this place existed. She found herself wondering who would devote years of effort to something that offered almost nothing in return. Outside, Caleb climbed onto the bed of his truck and lifted an old handheld spotlight toward the approach end of the runway, giving the pilots one more visual reference. The beam swept calmly across the pavement before settling beside the threshold markers. The engines grew louder with every passing second until the aircraft finally appeared overhead, graceful against the black Montana sky. Its wheels touched the runway with remarkable precision, followed by a gentle burst of tire smoke that disappeared almost immediately into the cold night air. The aircraft rolled forward smoothly, slowing with quiet dignity instead of urgency, until it finally came to a complete stop near the old hangar that had not welcomed a visitor in years. Caleb lowered the spotlight and released a long breath he had not realized he was holding. Around him, the prairie returned to silence. Only the soft ticking of cooling engines echoed through the valley. The forgotten runway had fulfilled its purpose once again. Moments later, the cabin door opened, and a portable staircase was lowered onto the pavement. Captain Mercer stepped out first, smiling with obvious gratitude. "You just gave us the safest landing available tonight," he called. Caleb simply nodded. "I am glad everyone made it safely." The captain extended his hand. You saved us more trouble than you know. Caleb shook it politely before glancing toward the passengers still leaving the cabin one by one. Business travelers carried briefcases. Flight attendants quietly unloaded small bags. Finally, a young blonde woman stepped onto the stairs with calm elegance, pausing halfway down to study the quiet airfield illuminated by warm amber lights. Olivia Reynolds looked across the empty runway until her eyes settled on the man standing beside the old utility truck. His jacket showed years of honest work. His boots were dusty with gravel. His face carried the peaceful expression of someone who expected neither applause nor recognition. For reasons she could not explain, she smiled before taking another step forward. Caleb returned the smile with simple kindness, unaware that the woman walking toward him led one of the most influential aviation companies in America, and equally unaware that this quiet meeting beneath a forgotten Montana sky had already begun changing both of their futures. Captain Mercer thanked Caleb once more before turning his attention to the flight crew, leaving the quiet man standing alone beside the utility truck as if saving airplanes in the middle of the night were nothing unusual. Olivia descended the last few steps and paused on the cool pavement. The crisp Montana air carried the scent of pine trees, damp earth, and diesel fuel from the old generator that still hummed steadily near the weathered hangar. It was strangely peaceful. She had landed at world-famous airports filled with polished marble, private lounges, and endless luxury, yet none of them had ever felt as genuine as this forgotten place. She walked toward Caleb with measured steps, offering a warm smile instead of the polished business expression that usually accompanied board meetings and interviews. I do not think thank you is enough, she said softly. Caleb slipped his work gloves into his jacket pocket and answered with an easy smile. Everyone walked away safely. That is enough for me. Olivia studied his face for a brief moment. There was no trace of pride, no expectation that she should recognize his effort. She had spent years surrounded by people who negotiated every favor before offering it. This man seemed completely different. Do you own this airstrip? She asked. Caleb shook his head. No, it belongs to the county. They stopped maintaining it years ago. Then why keep it alive? She asked with genuine curiosity. Caleb glanced toward the endless runway stretching quietly beneath the stars. Because sometimes the places everyone gives up on become the places somebody desperately needs. His answer lingered in the cold night air longer than either of them expected. Olivia found herself looking back toward the glowing runway. Every light represented hours of work no one had applauded. Every repaired crack had been fixed without contracts, investors, or headlines. It reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. Her grandfather had once told her that the strongest foundations were usually built where nobody was watching. A member of the flight crew approached. Ma'am, the weather system is expected to stay over the mountains until morning. The captain recommends waiting here until daylight. Olivia nodded. That sounds reasonable. The attendant hesitated before looking around the nearly empty property. Is there anywhere nearby to stay? Caleb answered before anyone else could. Silver Creek has a small family motel about 8 miles from here. If they are full, Mrs. Donnelly runs a bed and breakfast another 3 miles north. Captain Mercer smiled. You seem to know everyone around here. Caleb laughed quietly. Small towns make that easy. Just then, the distant headlights of an old pickup appeared along the gravel road leading toward the airstrip. The truck slowed before stopping beside the hangar, and an elderly sheriff stepped out, pulling his hat against the wind. I saw the runway lights from town, he called. Figured either the world was ending or Caleb finally got himself a visitor. Caleb smiled. Looks like it was the second one. The sheriff chuckled before shaking hands with the captain and greeting the passengers with calm hospitality. Olivia watched the exchange with growing admiration. It was obvious that everyone in Silver Creek respected Caleb, not because he held authority, but because he had quietly earned their trust over many years. Before leaving, the sheriff looked at Caleb and said with a grin, I suppose the town will finally believe you were not fixing that runway for nothing. Caleb only shrugged. I was never trying to prove anyone wrong. Olivia lowered her eyes for a moment after hearing those words. She had built a career proving people wrong. Standing beside this humble father beneath a sky filled with quiet stars, she wondered if there might be a better reason to build something than winning. She did not yet know his story, and Caleb certainly did not know hers. But somewhere deep inside both of them, something had begun to shift as gently and quietly as the first light before dawn. By the time the last passengers settled into the small motel on the edge of Silver Creek, the town itself had already begun whispering about the unexpected landing. In communities this small, extraordinary moments traveled faster than the morning wind. Before sunrise, the diner across Main Street buzzed with quiet conversations as ranchers, mechanics, and teachers gathered over fresh coffee. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward the old airstrip visible beyond the rolling hills, still glowing faintly beneath the first colors of dawn. Caleb, meanwhile, had already returned to work. Long before anyone else woke, he was replacing a cracked lens on one of the runway lights damaged by years of harsh Montana winters. He worked with patient hands, tightening each screw with the same care he used the day before. To him, last night's landing was not a reason to celebrate. It was simply proof that the work had mattered. A familiar voice interrupted the quiet. "I thought I might find you here." Caleb turned and saw Olivia walking across the grass, dressed simply in blue jeans, hiking boots, and a light jacket borrowed from the motel owner after the temperature dropped overnight. Without the formal business attire she usually wore, she looked more like an ordinary traveler than someone responsible for thousands of employees. She stopped beside him and looked down at the open toolbox. "You started working again already?" Caleb smiled without looking up. "Things break. They usually do not fix themselves." Olivia laughed softly. "You really never stop, do you?" "Not if I can help it." She watched him install the repaired light before asking, "Did you learn all of this in the Air Force?" Caleb paused briefly before nodding. "I worked around aircraft for several years. After I left, I figured knowledge does not disappear just because the uniform does." Olivia noticed that he offered only enough information to answer the question and nothing more. He did not speak about medals, achievements, or sacrifices. His quiet humility intrigued her far more than impressive titles ever had. They continued walking slowly along the edge of the runway as the morning sun painted the prairie with warm golden light. Birds drifted across the wide Montana sky, while gentle wind rolled through the tall grass surrounding the old pavement. Olivia breathed deeply and smiled. "This place feels different from anywhere I have been." Caleb nodded. "It reminds people that not everything valuable has to be new." They reached an old wooden bench facing the runway. Its faded paint had nearly disappeared, but the wood remained sturdy. Caleb brushed away a few fallen pine needles before sitting down. Olivia joined him, watching sunlight slowly chase away the last traces of darkness. "You have a daughter," she said after noticing a child's drawing tucked carefully inside the pocket of his work notebook. Caleb smiled immediately. "Lucy. She is 8 years old and believes every airplane has a story." Olivia studied the colorful drawing of a smiling airplane flying above mountains with two stick figures waving from below. Across the top, written in uneven crayon letters, were the words, "Never stop building hope." Something tightened gently inside Olivia's heart. She remembered sitting beside her own grandfather decades earlier, drawing airplanes on old newspaper while he taught her to dream beyond the limits of small towns. Success had brought her extraordinary opportunities, yet somewhere along the way she had forgotten the simple joy that first inspired those dreams. Looking at Caleb beside her, she quietly realized that while she had spent years building one of the largest aviation companies in America, this humble father had spent those same years building something even rarer. He had built hope where everyone else had only seen abandonment. And for the first time in a very long while, Olivia found herself wondering whether the most important investment she would ever make had nothing to do with business at all. After spending the morning at the airstrip, Caleb offered to drive Olivia back to town before the local cafe stopped serving breakfast. His aging pickup truck rattled gently along the narrow country road, the dashboard showing its years with faded buttons and tiny cracks that told stories of countless miles. Olivia smiled as she looked around the simple interior. There were no luxury features, only a neatly folded road map, a small first aid kit, and Lucy's latest school ribbon hanging beside the rearview mirror. She won first place in her science fair, Caleb explained when he noticed her looking at it. She built a model wind turbine from recycled parts. Olivia laughed warmly. "She sounds remarkably creative." Caleb nodded with quiet pride. "She gets that from her mother." His voice softened, but there was peace instead of sorrow. Olivia respected that silence and did not ask another question. A few minutes later, they reached Main Street, where the familiar smell of fresh cinnamon rolls drifted from the cafe. Inside, nearly every customer looked up as Caleb entered. Friendly smiles greeted him from every corner of the room. The waitress placed a cup of coffee in front of him without asking. "Good morning, Caleb." "The usual?" He smiled. "Thank you, Martha." Olivia noticed something unusual. Nobody treated Caleb like the man who had saved an airplane the previous night. They simply treated him as someone they trusted. That quiet respect seemed far more valuable than public praise. Martha turned toward Olivia with a cheerful smile. "You must be the traveler everyone has been talking about." Olivia nodded politely. "I suppose I am. Anyone who lands here after midnight becomes part of the town's story," Martha said with a laugh before returning to the kitchen. As they ate breakfast, the television mounted above the counter switched to a national business news program. Olivia instinctively lowered her eyes when the anchor began discussing a major aviation company preparing for an important announcement later that week. A photograph of the company's chief executive briefly appeared on the screen before the segment changed to financial markets. Caleb happened to be pouring syrup onto Lucy's favorite pancakes, which he had ordered to take home, and never looked toward the television. Olivia quietly released the breath she had been holding. For the first time in years, someone had spoken with her for hours without recognizing her title or her face. It felt unexpectedly freeing. After breakfast, they walked toward the town hardware store so Caleb could purchase replacement wiring for another runway light. Olivia insisted on carrying one of the small boxes. "You really do not have to help," Caleb said with a smile. "I know," she replied. "I simply want to." They crossed the street just as children were arriving at the elementary school. Suddenly, a small blonde girl with a bright red backpack spotted Caleb from across the sidewalk. "Daddy," Lucy called joyfully before running into his arms. Caleb knelt and hugged her tightly, lifting her effortlessly before setting her back on the ground. "Someone told me an airplane landed," Lucy said excitedly. "Was it as amazing as I imagined?" Caleb smiled. "Even better." Lucy then noticed Olivia standing nearby. Without hesitation, she offered a friendly wave. "Hi, I am Lucy." Olivia smiled and crouched to meet her at eye level. "It is very nice to meet you, Lucy." The little girl studied her for a moment before grinning. "Daddy likes helping people. Sometimes he forgets people can help him too." Caleb chuckled, slightly embarrassed, but Olivia felt those innocent words settle quietly in her heart. She had built an entire career solving enormous problems with wealth, technology, and influence. Yet a little girl had gently reminded her that receiving kindness required just as much grace as giving it. As the school bell rang across the crisp Montana morning, Olivia watched Caleb wave goodbye to his daughter, unaware that the greatest lesson of her unexpected journey had only just begun. That afternoon, the storm finally drifted east, leaving behind an impossibly clear Montana sky washed in deep shades of blue. Captain Daniel Mercer informed the passengers that the aircraft would remain grounded until additional maintenance inspections were completed, giving everyone an unexpected extra day in Silver Creek. While most of the travelers stayed inside the motel answering electronic mail and making phone calls, Olivia found herself walking back toward the old airstrip without quite knowing why. She discovered Caleb balancing on a small ladder beside one of the weathered runway lights, replacing another worn electrical connection with careful precision. He looked down and smiled as though he had expected the quiet company. "Good morning again," he said. Olivia laughed softly. "It is already afternoon." Caleb glanced toward the sun and shook his head with a grin. "I suppose I lost track of time." Without another word, she picked up a toolbox resting nearby and carried it to the next light. Caleb climbed down, slightly surprised. "You really are determined to help." Olivia smiled. "You told me yesterday that things do not fix themselves. I have been thinking about that ever since." Together, they moved slowly down the runway, replacing cracked reflectors, clearing weeds growing along the pavement, and tightening loose bolts that winter frost had slowly worked free over the years. Their conversations came naturally, never rushed and never forced. They spoke about books they enjoyed, quiet places they loved, childhood memories, and the simple comfort of watching airplanes disappear into wide open skies. Caleb never asked what company Olivia worked for, and she never volunteered the answer. For the first time in many years, she enjoyed being known only by her first name. As the afternoon faded, Lucy arrived after school carrying a small paper bag. Mrs. Martha packed extra blueberry muffins, she announced proudly. She said nobody should repair runways on an empty stomach. The three of them sat together on the old wooden bench facing the airfield, while the warm breeze carried the scent of fresh grass across the valley. Lucy happily described her science class, her favorite library books, and her dream of becoming an engineer who designed airplanes that could help small towns stay connected. Olivia listened with genuine admiration. Every dream the little girl described centered on helping other people rather than becoming famous. It reminded her of the values she once held before endless meetings, quarterly reports, and investor expectations had slowly crowded them aside. Later, while Lucy chased butterflies near the edge of the field, Olivia quietly asked Caleb, "Do you ever wish you had chosen a different life?" Caleb looked toward his daughter before answering. "Life chose some difficult chapters for me, but every morning I still get to choose the kind of man Lucy sees when she wakes up. That part has always been mine." Olivia lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the quiet wisdom behind his words. She had spent years measuring success through expansion, revenue, and market share. Caleb measured success by whether his daughter could trust the man she called her father. The difference humbled her. As sunset painted the mountains with soft shades of gold and crimson, the sound of another vehicle approached the airstrip. A black sport utility vehicle rolled slowly to a stop near the hangar, followed by another behind it. Several men and women stepped out wearing tailored business suits instead of hiking boots or work clothes. The moment the lead woman spotted Olivia, her expression changed from concern to unmistakable relief. She hurried forward and spoke before anyone else could. "Ms. Reynolds, we have been searching everywhere for you. The board is waiting, and every major network wants a statement." Caleb stood quietly beside the ladder, his smile fading into thoughtful silence as he turned toward Olivia, hearing her last name spoken for the very first time. The air around the quiet runway seemed to stand still. Olivia looked at the members of her executive team for a long moment before slowly turning back toward Caleb. There was no surprise on his face, no disappointment, and certainly no change in the calm expression that had welcomed a complete stranger only a day earlier. He simply waited. The woman who had addressed Olivia stepped forward respectfully. "Ms. Reynolds, the board meeting has already been delayed twice. Investors are asking questions, and every major aviation network is covering your disappearance." Lucy looked curiously from Olivia to the neatly dressed visitors. "You are important?" she asked with the innocent honesty only a child could possess. Olivia smiled gently and knelt beside her. "I suppose some people would say that." Lucy tilted her head. "Daddy says everyone is important." Olivia's smile grew warmer, touched by the quiet wisdom she had come to expect from the little girl. Rising to her feet, she finally faced Caleb. "There is something I should have told you from the beginning." Caleb nodded softly. "You were waiting until the time felt right." Olivia looked surprised. "You are not upset?" He shook his head. "Everyone deserves the chance to be known before being judged by a title." Those simple words settled over the group more heavily than any speech. Several executives exchanged quiet glances, surprised that the man standing in worn work boots had responded with such grace instead of resentment. Olivia drew a slow breath. "My full name is Olivia Reynolds. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Reynolds Aerospace Systems." The executives stood silently behind her, accustomed to seeing people react with amazement the moment her title was spoken. Caleb simply smiled politely and extended his hand once again. "It is nice to officially meet you, Olivia." She laughed softly, almost relieved by his response, before shaking his hand. Nothing about the gesture felt different from the first time they had met beneath the runway lights. There were no cameras, no reporters, and no expectations. Only two people standing beneath an endless Montana sky. One of the senior executives stepped forward carrying a leather folder. "Ms. Reynolds, we have already begun discussing a proposal. This airstrip could become an excellent regional testing facility. We could purchase the property immediately." Olivia accepted the folder but did not open it. Instead, she turned toward the weathered runway stretching quietly into the distance. Every repaired light reflected the afternoon sun. Every section of concrete carried the marks of years of patient work. She finally looked back at Caleb. "If someone offered you enough money to walk away from this place forever, would you accept it?" Caleb did not answer immediately. He watched Lucy drawing another airplane in her notebook while sitting on the old wooden bench. After a thoughtful silence, he replied, "This runway was never my dream because of the land. It was my dream because someday someone might need hope waiting for them at the end of it. Money cannot replace that." Olivia slowly closed the leather folder. "Then I do not want to buy it." Her executives stared in disbelief. She continued with quiet certainty, "I want to help restore it exactly as the community deserves. Not by taking it away from them, but by working beside them." The words stunned everyone except Caleb, who simply smiled as though he had expected nothing less from the woman he had come to know over the past 2 days. Olivia then turned toward her leadership team. "Prepare a partnership proposal with the county instead of a purchase agreement. Every improvement must preserve local ownership. This runway belongs to the people who believed in it long before we arrived." For a brief moment, complete silence settled across the airfield. Even the executives who had negotiated billion-dollar agreements for years found themselves unexpectedly humbled by the decision. And standing quietly beside the old runway, Caleb realized that the strongest leaders were not always the ones who owned the most. Sometimes they were simply the ones willing to honor what someone else had spent years building with faith, patience, and quiet dignity. 6 months later, the forgotten airstrip looked familiar and completely transformed at the same time. The original runway remained exactly where it had always been, stretching across the Montana prairie beneath the same endless sky, but now its lights shone with dependable brilliance every evening. The cracked hangar had been carefully restored instead of replaced. A modest new operations building stood nearby, designed to match the character of the town rather than overpower it. Local contractors had completed most of the work, local businesses supplied the materials whenever possible, and every decision had honored the promise Olivia made on that quiet afternoon. Silver Creek had not lost its identity. It had rediscovered its purpose. Caleb still arrived before sunrise each morning, although these days he no longer worked alone. Young mechanics, aviation students, and volunteers from neighboring counties often joined him, eager to learn from the patient man who never raised his voice and never claimed credit for what had become possible. Whenever someone praised the remarkable transformation, Caleb simply pointed toward the runway and said, "It has always been worth believing in." More people finally noticed. Lucy had grown taller over those months, and her notebook had become filled with sketches of airplanes, engineers, and smiling travelers arriving in small towns across America. On the morning of the official reopening ceremony, she proudly wore a blue dress and the same science fair ribbon that still hung inside her father's pickup truck. Standing beside Olivia near the ribbon stretched across the entrance, she whispered, "Do you think Mom would have liked this place?" Caleb gently squeezed her hand. "I think she would have loved seeing the person you are becoming." Lucy smiled through grateful eyes before looking toward Olivia. Without hesitation, she reached over and took her hand too. The simple gesture needed no explanation. As families, neighbors, pilots, and community leaders gathered around the restored runway, Sheriff Collins stepped to the microphone first. He smiled toward Caleb before speaking. Sometimes progress arrives with loud speeches and grand promises. But sometimes it begins with one quiet person carrying a toolbox before the rest of us are awake. This place exists today because one father refused to believe that forgotten meant worthless. The crowd answered with warm applause, but Caleb lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Olivia noticed and smiled. She understood him now. True dignity never searched for a spotlight. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stepped to the podium without notes. "People often ask what the greatest investment of my career has been," she began. "For a long time, I believed the answer could be measured in dollars, technology, or growth. I was wrong. The greatest investment is believing in people before the world notices them. This runway did not change because a company arrived. It changed because a good man never stopped preparing for someone he had not even met." She looked directly at Caleb before continuing. "Leadership is not about owning the future. It is about making sure someone else has a place to land when life becomes uncertain." The ribbon was cut by Lucy, whose joyful smile drew laughter and applause from everyone gathered nearby. Moments later, the first aircraft of the new chapter rolled gently onto the runway. As its engines carried it into the bright morning sky, dozens of people looked upward with quiet admiration. Caleb and Olivia stood side by side, without saying a word. None was needed. The wind moved softly across the prairie just as it had on the night they first met, carrying the familiar scent of pine trees and fresh earth. Some journeys begin with perfect plans. Others begin because one ordinary father chooses to keep a forgotten light burning for someone he has never met. And in the quiet grace of that simple choice, 2 lives, 1 small town, and countless futures found exactly where they belonged.